How long could you go without your laptop? Can you imagine coming home and not being able to watch TV? Could you even make it home without the use of your GPS? No? Well, thanks to technology invented in the Cold War and the space race, you can. The growing tension between Russia and NATO after World War I was known as the Cold War. Both Russia and the US were looking for new ways to both defend their land and gather enemy intelligence. This tension and thirst for technology led inventors and scientists to look to the sky. Both sides engaged in what was known as the space race, which helped relieve some of the extreme tensions. This new technology not only led to more efficient ways of fighting, but also changed the way many people live their lives. The tension between Russia and the US started to grow in World War II. Communist Russia saw the West as a threat against their communist ways. Russia also surprised the US by signing the Nazi-Soviet Pact, even though Stalin only did this in order to protect Russia. The pact damaged Russia and US relations. This tension continued to build due to the events such as the U-2 spy plane downed in Russia and the Cuban Missile Crisis during the space race. Russia launched the first satellite to make it into orbit on October 4th, 1957. Its name was Sputnik. Sputnik scared many Americans because they felt and heard the watchful eye of the Russian military spying on them. It also scared many US officials because, quote, if the USSR could put a ball into the air, that means that they can put a missile there too.
CBS Television presents a special report on Sputnik 1, the Soviet space satellite. Douglas Edwards reporting.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik, the first man-made satellite as it passed over New York earlier today.
Russia's next great achievement was putting the first man into space in 1961. The small spacecraft was only meant to launch Mr. Yuri Gagarin into orbit. The mission was successful and Yuri returned to the ground safely. Later, Yuri died while test piloting a new plane that the Russian military had developed. After this event, President Kennedy went before Congress to request a space mission that many thought may be impossible. He didn't want to fall back in the technological race to explore space. He wanted US to go to the moon. After Congress gave him the go-ahead, the US space program started to pull all of its time and energy into completing this goal. This clip is one of President Kennedy's greatest speeches, and shows the motivation of the U.S. to do something great.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
This next clip is part of the same speech Kennedy was giving and clearly shows the motivation of the U.S. to beat the Soviets in the race to the moon.
Within these last 19 months, at least 45 satellites have circled the Earth. Some 40 of them were made in the United States of America, and they were far more sophisticated and supplied far more knowledge to the people of the world than those of the Soviet Union. The Mariner spacecraft now on its way to Venus, is the most intricate instrument in the history of space science. The accuracy of that shot is comparable to firing a missile from Cape Canaveral and dropping it in this stadium between the 40-yard lines. Transit satellites are helping our ships at sea to steer a safer course. Tyrus satellites have given us unprecedented warnings of hurricanes and storms, and will do the same for forest fires and icebergs. We have had our failures, but so have others, even if they do not admit them, and they may be less public. To be sure, we are behind, and will be behind for some time in manned flight. But we do not intend to stay behind, and in this decade, we shall make up and move ahead.
We put the first man on the moon on July 16, 1969. This was a huge win for us because with this achievement, we were able to perform many experiments that helped us advance our technology even further. The men we sent on this mission were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin.
2, 1, 0, all engines running. Liftoff, we have a liftoff, 33 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Fine. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The lamb footpads are only impressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the lamb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Even though this was a serious mission to gather data, Neil can't help but enjoy himself.
Hippity hopping over hill and dale. Da 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 da. Hippity hopping along.
When leaving the moon, these men left a medallion with Yuri's name on it, out of respect for what he had accomplished. During their time on the moon, Neil and Buzz tested the properties of lunar soil, collected lunar wind samples, and tested the effects of lunar dust on an experiment package. They also used a laser to detect exactly how far the moon is from the Earth. On April 12, 1981, NASA's first shuttle, the Columbia Orbiter, was launched into space. This was the first reusable spacecraft ever made. The design allowed it to launch into orbit acting like a rocket, and the return flying like a glider. The purpose of this large ship was to be able to carry satellites or other large payloads into space, and to be able to return with them safely in case they needed repairs. The 2 men piloting the shuttle on the first mission were John Young and Robert Crippen. The space race created the world we live in now, a world relying on satellites. In the early 1970s, Russia started testing anti-satellite weapons. These weapons were used to either completely destroy satellites with the Hunter-Killer satellite or disable them with a ground-based laser. These weapons were never put to use, but posed a big threat to our national security. Satellites were used to protect against missiles, gather enemy intelligence, and communicate with troops in times of war. If our satellites were to be taken out, the U.S. would be defenseless against new Russian weaponry. Our reliance on satellites has only grown. Today, civilians, as well as the military, use satellites. While civilians only use them for things of minor importance, such as watching TV or taking money from the ATM, the U.S. military now uses them to communicate with troops, fly drones, and fly GPS-guided missiles. Russia was way ahead of the rest of the world in the idea of anti-satellite technology. Today, many are worried about the use of these weapons to take out the eyes and ears of an entire nation. Both Russia and China have been successful in their testing of this new technology. Due to the fact that satellites are in space, there is a question of whether or not an attack on a satellite is a declaration of war on another country. China's testing of their anti-satellite missile created an abundance of space debris. This debris is incredibly dangerous because it can tear through satellites, space shuttles, and almost everything we put into orbit. There are about 23,000 objects in orbit around Earth, and most of them created from space debris. This clip will help show just how dangerous space debris can be.
Man down! Man down! Explorer's been hit.
The US learned about a lot of the Russians' technology and weapons in development through the DIA. The DIA stands for the Defense Intelligence Agency. DIA artists created thousands of drawings of Russian weapons and threats. Among these were the Cosmos 389, laser defenses, AMBs, ground-based lasers, and the Eurocon plan. I found these inventions intriguing because with these, Russia had an edge on the US. The Cosmos 389 was a small ferret satellite. It was used to lock onto radar and radio missions in order to locate US defense sites and command centers. The laser defense was a mobile laser that was mounted on the back of a truck. This was no ordinary laser. It didn't just jam the plane's signal or blind the pilot. It melted through the body of an aircraft and set it on fire. If this laser had made it past the prototype stage, the US wouldn't have been able to send airstrikes or bombers to Russia. This laser also made it through the testing stage, but couldn't be produced due to the economic collapse. AMB stands for Anti-Ballistics Missile. Russia was the first to produce an AMB, and its purpose was to intercept warheads and other ballistic missiles that were fired at Russia. They named it Pachiko. This technology was pushed through the prototype stage and installed around the outskirts of Moscow in the 1970s. Pachiko was later upgraded to a nuclear-tipped interceptor missile. This missile was silo-based and had a larger radar for better control. Russia made the ground-based laser because, well, you can never have too many lasers, right? This laser would have been used to scramble overhead satellites. Although the US claimed that there was proof of a laser gap technology, the laser never made it through the prototype stage. The laser was way ahead of its time because it did not destroy satellites and create more space debris. It only scrambled their signals. If this technology was put into use then, the US wouldn't have been able to use any of their land-based missiles. The Ukraino plan was an invention that could have easily allowed the Russians to transport troops to the US in an invasion-type situation. The Ukraino was a plan to make something that looks like a mixture of a carrier plane and a large boat. The plane was the size of an American football field and could hold hundreds of soldiers or a battery of missiles and could fly below radar without detection. The idea was that the plane would use something called ground effect. The ground effect happens when a plane flies low near a fixed surface. The plane starts to generate its own lift. Basically, the plane would fly as low as 60 feet above the water, and the loft created lets a plane ride on its own bubble of air. In the 1970s, the US shot a picture of this giant plane, and at first thought it was a jumbo jet. But then, why would a jumbo jet be in the water? They also saw that the wings were clipped. After helpful intel and much thinking, they figured out that it was a ground effect vehicle. This plane was never mass-produced like Russia hoped it would be, but it did make it past the testing stage and managed to stump Americans' best scientists. How did the US get this picture, you might ask? Well, they used the U-2 spy plane. This plane could take detailed pictures of Russian weaponry from above. It was used to take pictures of Russian bases and defenses from more than 70,000 feet above the ground. In May of 1960, Russia spotted a U-2 spy plane flying above them and shot it down. The pilot, Francis Powers, was placed in prison by the Russian government with the charge of espionage. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. After this event, President Eisenhower was forced to admit that the U.S. had been running secret CIA missions over Russia to gather intel. This event only made the tension worse between the two forces. All of these inventions and advancements in technology have also benefited civilians in their everyday lives. For example, this invention changed the way that most people and businesses function by making it easy to find exactly where you are from anywhere in the world. You guessed it, it's the GPS. The Global Positioning System is a series of satellites that orbit in a set position and beam down signals to anyone with a GPS receiver. These signals carry a time code and geographical data point that allows the user to pinpoint their exact position, speed, and time anywhere on the planet. The GPS was created in the 1960s for the use of military agencies. Its original use was to allow the U.S. Navy to fix their position of their ships every time that they received a signal. After this proved to be effective, the GPS technology quickly advanced, leading to 11 block satellites put into orbit by 1985. Civilians were given the use of GPS in 1983 by the Reagan administration. The reasoning behind the release of the technology was to ensure that American flights would not wander off course. Between 1959 and 1972, the U.S. created the Corona program. U.S. spy planes flew regular missions across the border, but could not fly past the outskirts of Russia because they feared being seen and shot down. Because of this, the U.S. could not capture photos near the center of Russia, where crucial information was being held. The Corona project created a satellite that could take photos from space. The first ever image taken by Corona was taken on August 19th, 1960. This is a picture of a Russian airfield taken by the satellite. After only 17 orbits around Earth, the satellite identified 64 Soviet airfields and 24 surface-to-air sites. Satellite imagery today is used to identify weather patterns and show where storms might hit. Live TV was also created thanks to satellites. It's shocking to think that the U.S. had made it without live television for this long, isn't it? Today, live TV helps us know what's going on around the world. It keeps us safe when bad weather hits. It lets us see the big game without going to the stadium. Telstar was the name of the incredible satellite that changed the way not only America, but the world as a whole viewed the news. It was about the size of a beach ball and weighed 170 pounds. It was designed by AT&T and thought into existence by Bell Labs. Telstar was launched from the shores of Cape Canaveral on July 10, 1962. Because AT&T paid NASA $3 million to launch this satellite, the Telstar project was the first ever personally sponsored space initiative. On the evening of July 23, 1962, the world stood still. Everyone's eyes were glued to the television screen in anticipation of the first ever live broadcast. Suddenly, a black and white image of Lady Liberty flickered onto the screen. The Eiffel Tower stood to her right. A voice pierced through the silence saying, "Good evening, Europe. This is the North America continent, live via AT&T Telstar, July 23, 1962. Viewers later saw some of a baseball game going on at Wrigley Field and were switched to President Kennedy's speech. 3 hours after the satellite had orbited back into position, Europe broadcasted a live tour of the great sights they had, such as Big Ben and the Sistine Chapel. The internet has become the backbone to our society that we live in today. The government uses it, the military uses it, even civilians use it, but most important of all, our school uses it. The internet was created because in 1962, the U.S. feared that if Russia launched a missile and hit U.S. telephone systems, that the whole network that made long-distance communication possible would be destroyed. In response to this, a scientist named J.C.R. Licklider, proposed that a galactic network of computers should be created. This would allow computers to talk to one another without the use of telephone lines. An early version of this was called packet switching. It broke information down into blocks and sends them through the government computer network. The government computer system, known as ARPANET, sent its first message in 1969. The message was no more than 4 letters saying, "Log in." This message was sent from one computer located at UCLA that was the size of a small house to another at Stanford. Only the first 2 letters got through before the giant computer crashed. But this short message proved that communication through network could be done. By the 1970s, this problem had been solved thanks to the TCP, Transmission Controlled Protocol. This system was a way for all of the computers around the world to connect their mini networks in order to communicate. The creation of all this incredible technology wouldn't have been possible without the motivation of the US that came from the Cold War. In concluding, the world as a whole was impacted by the technology that came out of the Cold War, and most Americans could not function without the technological advancements. Because of past conflicts resulting in a new wealth of technology, you can now find your way home and relax by watching your favorite TV show after you email your friends from your computer.
We are go for a mission to the moon. Ignition sequence start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff. We have liftoff.
That is an interplanetary flying space saucer.